"Sir, this is a restricted area. I need you to step back immediately." The voice was sharp, laced with the unearned confidence of youth and new authority. Lieutenant Davies, barely a year out of the academy, stood with his hands on his hips, his posture a textbook example of assertive command. He was speaking to an old man who had appeared as if from the heat haze itself. The man was thin, wearing a faded polo shirt, simple khaki pants, and a plain, unadorned baseball cap that did little to shield his deeply wrinkled face from the glare. He stood perfectly still, his gaze fixed not on Davies but on the wounded aircraft 100 yards away. His eyes, a pale and piercing blue, seemed to be calculating, diagnosing. "Do you understand English, sir?" Davies pressed, his voice rising a notch. His partner, a young airman, shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable. The old man didn't flinch. He just gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, his eyes never leaving the plane. "I need to see some identification, and then you need to leave the flight line," Davies commanded, stepping closer. "This is an active crash scene, not a tourist attraction." The old man finally turned his head, his movements economical and deliberate. He looked at the lieutenant, his expression not one of defiance or confusion, but of a deep, weary patience. It was the look of a man who had waited out storms far greater than this boy's bluster. He slowly reached for his back pocket, his knuckles swollen with age. Davies watched the movement with suspicion, his hand instinctively drifting down to rest on the grip of his sidearm. The scene did not go unnoticed. The ground crews, mechanics, and pilots held at the perimeter watched the drama unfold. They were a captive audience. The downed A-10 was their patient, and they were surgeons locked out of the operating room. The delay was agonizing, and this strange confrontation between the crisp, uniformed lieutenant and the anonymous old man was a bizarre distraction. Whispers rippled through the small crowd of airmen. Who was the old guy? How did he even get this close? Some of the younger ones snickered at the lieutenant's aggressive posture towards a man who looked like he could be their grandfather. The older NCOs just watched, their faces unreadable, sensing that something was off. Lieutenant Davies felt their eyes on him. He was the authority here. He was in charge of securing the scene. This old man was a variable he hadn't accounted for, a breach in his perfect perimeter. The scrutiny of the crowd, combined with the old man's infuriating calm, frayed his composure. He had to reassert control. "Let's go, Grandpa," he snapped, his voice echoing a little too loudly in the tense quiet. "I don't have all day. The ID. Now." The old man had his wallet out. It was ancient, a block of cracked brown leather softened by decades of use, held together more by memory than by its stitching. He fumbled with it, his fingers stiff. He wasn't looking for a driver's license. He was trying to work something free from a faded, yellowed plastic sleeve. Davies let out an exasperated sigh. "Sir, if you can't produce a valid ID, I will have to detain you. This is your final warning." He gestured to his partner, a silent command to be ready to move in. The airman took a half step forward, his own reluctance visible in his hesitation. The crowd murmured. A few of the maintenance chiefs exchanged grim looks. This was escalating. It felt wrong. Disrespect hung in the hot jet fuel-scented air. They were all focused on the broken machine on the runway, a symbol of air power and resilience currently helpless. And here, in its shadow, a different kind of breakdown was occurring. A breakdown of courtesy, of respect. The old man finally extracted the card he was looking for. It wasn't a state-issued license. It was a simple laminated card, dog-eared and worn. He held it out. Davies snatched it from his hand impatiently. He glanced at it, then did a double take. "Retired," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. He read the name aloud, mispronouncing it slightly. "Colonel Wesley Miller. So you were in the service. That doesn't give you a free pass to wander onto an active runway, Colonel." He held the ID up as if it were a novelty. "This thing is practically an antique, just like its owner." A few of the younger airmen laughed nervously. The older NCOs did not. They went rigid. One master sergeant, a man named Chen who ran the entire maintenance squadron for the A-10s, felt a jolt, as if from a live wire. Miller, Colonel Wesley Miller. He'd heard that name. It was a ghost story, a legend told over greasy tools and late-night diagnostics. The ghost of Kandahar, the Warthog whisperer. The old man's calm finally seemed to crack, but only in his eyes. A flicker of something, not anger but a profound sadness, passed through them as he looked at the young lieutenant mocking his credentials. As he'd pulled the ID from his wallet, his thumb had brushed against a small, heavy object tucked into a leather fold. It was a small brass plaque, no bigger than a matchbook, its surface tarnished and smooth from years of contact with his hand. For a heartbeat, the blazing Arizona sun vanished, replaced by the dim, sand-blasted light of a makeshift hangar in a forgotten corner of Afghanistan. The air smelled of cordite and ozone. A much younger Wes Miller, his flight suit stained with sweat and grime, stood before an A-10 that looked less like an airplane and more like a colander. Its skin was peppered with hundreds of jagged holes from anti-aircraft fire. A young crew chief, his face smeared with grease and tears of relief, pressed a small, newly engraved brass plaque into his hand. It was a piece of the destroyed instrument panel from the cockpit. "You brought her home, sir," the chief had choked out, his voice thick with emotion. "Nobody else could have." Back in the present, Davies handed the ID back with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "Okay, Colonel, you've had your fun. Time to go. My partner will escort you back to the gate." He was turning away, considering the matter closed, the annoyance dealt with. The old man, Colonel Miller, simply slipped his ID back into his wallet, his thumb finding the familiar comfort of the brass plaque within. He didn't move. He just looked back at the crippled Warthog, a silent vigil for a machine he knew better than he knew himself. His stillness was a quiet act of defiance that the lieutenant simply couldn't comprehend. Master Sergeant Chen watched the entire exchange, a cold knot forming in his stomach. He'd seen the name on the ID. He'd seen the condescending way Davies had read it. Miller. Grizz Miller. It couldn't be. Not here. Not now. The legend said he'd retired to some quiet place, vanished from the world of flight lines and sortie boards. Chen looked at the old man's posture, the unnerving calm, the way his eyes dissected the wounded aircraft. It wasn't the gaze of a curious bystander. It was the focused, analytical stare of a master craftsman examining a broken instrument. This was a train wreck in slow motion. Davies was a lieutenant, full of regulations but empty of experience. He saw a security violation. Chen saw a titan of aviation history being humiliated by a child in uniform. He knew the base commander, Colonel Wallace. Wallace was a pilot's pilot. He revered the history of the Air Force, especially the legends of the A-10. If he found out that Grizz Miller was being treated like a vagrant on his own flight line, heads would not just roll, they would be launched into orbit. Chen couldn't let it happen. He backed away from the crowd quietly, pulling his phone from his pocket. He didn't have the commander's cell number, but he had the next best thing, the direct line to the command chief's office, the highest-ranking enlisted member on the base. His thumb flew across the screen. He found the number and pressed call, his heart pounding against his ribs. A calm, professional voice answered on the second ring. "Command Chief's office, this is Senior Airman Peters." "Peters, this is Master Sergeant Chen out at the Runway incident," he said, keeping his voice low and urgent. "Listen to me very carefully. I need you to get a message to the command chief or the base commander directly. I don't care if he's in a meeting with God himself." "You interrupt him, Sergeant. The colonel is tied up," Peters began, a hint of annoyance in his voice. "I understand that," Chen cut in, his voice tight. "But you need to tell him that Colonel Wesley Miller is here, on the flight line, and Lieutenant Davies from Security Forces is about to put him in cuffs." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. Chen could practically hear the airman's brain processing the information. "Colonel Miller, are you sure, Sergeant? I saw his ID, the man they call Grizz. He's here, and the situation is getting out of hand. Tell the colonel it's an angel down situation. He'll understand. Just do it. Now." Chen hung up before the airman could ask another question. He looked back toward the scene. Davies was now gesturing emphatically, his voice rising again, his patience completely gone. Chen could only pray the message would travel fast enough. Inside the sprawling headquarters building known as the White House, Senior Airman Peters stood frozen for a second, the phone still pressed to his ear. Master Sergeant Chen's words echoed in his mind. Angel down. It wasn't an official code, but it was a piece of institutional slang used for a catastrophic failure of protocol involving a VIP. And the name, Colonel Wesley Miller. Peters didn't know the full legend, but he'd heard the whispers. Every A-10 maintenance tech, every pilot, knew the name Grizz. He was a ghost, a myth from the golden age of the Warthog. He burst from his desk and ran past the front office, heading directly for the closed doors of the commander's conference room. He didn't knock. He threw the doors open. Inside, Base Commander Colonel Wallace was in the middle of a tense briefing with a visiting congressional delegation. Heads snapped up, annoyance flashing across a dozen faces. Colonel Wallace fixed Peters with a look that could melt steel. "Airman, this had better be the end of the world," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Peters was breathing hard, his face pale. "Sir," he gasped, "I apologize for the interruption. Master Sergeant Chen from the flight line," he said. The annoyance on Colonel Wallace's face vanished, replaced by a look of utter slack-jawed disbelief. The visiting congressman, a former Navy pilot himself, sat up straighter. "Grizz Miller? Is he still around?" "Sir, there's more," Peters continued, his voice trembling slightly. "Security forces is detaining him. Lieutenant Davies, Sergeant Chen said to tell you it's an angel down situation." A flash of pure, unadulterated fury crossed Wallace's face. He slammed a hand down on the polished mahogany table, making the water glasses jump. "Get me my car," he roared at his aide, already pushing his chair back and storming towards the door. "Get the honor guard spun up. I want them on the flight line in 5 minutes. Move." He turned back to the stunned delegation. "Congressman, ladies and gentlemen, you are about to witness a piece of Air Force history. I suggest you come with me." Back on the sun-baked tarmac, Lieutenant Davies had reached the end of his rope. The old man's silent refusal to be dismissed was a direct challenge to his authority, and in front of a growing audience it was intolerable. He had given warnings. He had followed procedure. Now came the consequence. "That's it," Davies announced, his voice tight with anger. He unclipped his handcuffs from his belt, the metallic click loud in the charged atmosphere. "You are under official detainment for failing to obey a lawful order and interfering with a critical aircraft incident. Turn around and place your hands behind your back." Now, a collective gasp went through the crowd of onlookers. Even the younger airmen who had been snickering were now silent, their eyes wide. They were about to watch an 80-year-old man get cuffed on the flight line. It felt sacrilegious. Colonel Miller finally looked away from the broken A-10 and met the lieutenant's furious gaze. He didn't look scared. He looked disappointed. He gave a small, sad shake of his head and with the slowness of his years began to turn around as commanded. Just as Davies reached for the old man's arm, a sound cut through the air, sharp and urgent, the squeal of tires on asphalt. A black command vehicle, a Ford Expedition with official plates and flashing lights, fishtailed to a halt just yards away, its doors flying open before it had fully stopped. Colonel Wallace erupted from the passenger side, his face a thundercloud of controlled rage. He was followed by his command chief and several other senior officers. Behind them, 2 more security trucks screeched up, and from the back a dozen members of the base honor guard began to disembark, their movements crisp and practiced. The spectacle was stunning. The entire focus of the flight line shifted in an instant. The downed Warthog was forgotten. The fire crews stood frozen. Lieutenant Davies stood with his handcuffs dangling uselessly from his hand, his mouth hanging open. Colonel Wallace didn't spare Davies a single glance. His eyes were locked on Colonel Miller. He strode across the tarmac with a purpose that seemed to warp the very air around him. He marched past the shell-shocked lieutenant as if he were a piece of misplaced equipment and came to a halt precisely 3 feet in front of the old man. In the sudden profound silence, Colonel Wallace's body snapped into the most rigid, powerful salute of his life. His hand sliced through the air and stopped, quivering with intensity beside the brim of his hat. "Colonel Miller, sir." Wallace's voice boomed across the flight line, a crack of thunder that startled everyone present. "Colonel Frank Wallace. It is an absolute honor to have you on my base, sir." The world seemed to stop. Lieutenant Davies's face went from confused to terrified as the blood drained from it. The crowd of airmen who had been a loose collection of individuals now seemed to solidify into a single awestruck entity. Every NCO present, led by Master Sergeant Chen, instinctively snapped to attention. Colonel Miller looked at the saluting base commander and slowly, a little stiffly, raised a hand to return the gesture. A faint wry smile touched the corners of his lips. "At ease, Colonel. It's been a while since anyone's made that much fuss over me." Wallace dropped his salute but remained at attention. He turned to the assembled crowd of pilots, maintainers, and security personnel. His voice was now that of a historian, a storyteller revealing a sacred text. "Airmen," he began, his voice resonating with pride. "For those of you who do not know, I want you to understand who you are looking at. This is Colonel Wesley Grizz Miller. This man has more than 5,000 hours in the A-10. He didn't just fly the Warthog. In many ways, he helped build its legend. He was one of the original test pilots who refined its combat tactics. The emergency procedure for a full hydraulic failure over hostile territory. He wrote it. After his A-10 took a missile to the starboard engine over a rock, he flew it 200 miles back to base on one engine and no landing gear. He pointed a finger toward the damaged aircraft on the runway. That machine is the toughest, most resilient close air support platform ever built, and it's because of men like Colonel Miller, who pushed it to its limits and brought it back when no one else could. The maneuver known as the Kandahar Jink, which has saved at least a dozen pilots' lives, was named for him after he used it to evade 6 enemy man-pads, bringing home an aircraft with over 300 bullet holes in it. A wave of understanding and profound respect washed over the crowd. The whispers were now ones of awe. Phones were out, recording, but not for the drama. They were recording for history. They were in the presence of a giant. Master Sergeant Chen allowed himself a small, relieved smile. The angel had been saved. Colonel Wallace let the weight of his words settle for a moment before he turned his gaze, now as cold as the void of space, onto Lieutenant Davies. The young officer looked like he wanted the tarmac to open up and swallow him whole. "Lieutenant," Wallace said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal hum that was far more terrifying than his earlier shouting. "You will report to my office at 1500 hours. You will be accompanied by your squadron commander and your chief. You will be in your service dress uniform, and you will be prepared to explain to me, in excruciating detail, why you felt it was appropriate to threaten, humiliate, and attempt to handcuff a living legend of the United States Air Force. You will explain why you chose arrogance over curiosity, and procedure over respect. Is that understood, Lieutenant?" "Sir, yes, sir," Davies whispered, his voice cracking. He looked like a child who had just been told his world was ending. Colonel Miller took a slow step forward, placing a gentle hand on Wallace's arm. "Frank," he said, his voice quiet but firm, carrying easily in the silence. "The lieutenant was doing his job. Securing the area is his priority. He was just a little enthusiastic in his execution." He turned his pale blue eyes on Davies, and there was no malice in them, only a weary wisdom. "Son, a uniform and a rulebook give you authority. But respect is something you have to earn, one person at a time. Learn to see the man, not just the potential infraction. That's a lesson that'll serve you better than any regulation." The grace of the gesture was stunning. Miller was not only sparing the lieutenant from further public humiliation but was also offering him a lifeline, a piece of hard-won wisdom from a lifetime of command. Davies could only nod, his eyes glassy with shame. Colonel Wallace, still tense, noticed Miller's old wallet, which was still in his hand. The corner of the small, tarnished brass plaque was visible. "Sir," Wallace said, his voice softening with reverence. "Is that from 780592, the ghost of Kandahar?" Miller nodded, pulling the plaque out for him to see. "A reminder," he said simply, "that the machine is only as good as the people who fly it and the people who fix it." The image flashed again, clearer this time. The exhausted Captain Wes Miller stood in the Afghan hangar, the air thick with the smell of burned wiring. The young crew chief, face streaked with tears and hydraulic fluid, pressed the plaque into his hand. It was a jagged piece of the instrument panel, torn free by shrapnel. "We thought she was gone, sir," the chief had said, his voice breaking. "We all did. You brought her home." Miller had looked at the weeping, grateful young man and understood that the bond between pilot and crew was as vital as any control surface, as strong as any titanium spar. He had carried that piece of metal with him every day since. In the weeks that followed, a new mandatory training block appeared on the schedule for all personnel at Davis-Monthan. It was titled Professional Bearing and the Legacy of Service. The central case study was the story of Lieutenant Davies and Colonel Miller on the flight line. The tale became an instant base legend, a cautionary tale about the difference between authority and leadership. Lieutenant Davies sat in the front row of the first session, his face impassive but his eyes attentive. He had been formally reprimanded but, thanks to Miller's intervention, had kept his commission. The real punishment was the knowledge of his failure, a burden he would carry for the rest of his career. A month later, Davies was sitting in a booth at a small diner off base, nursing a cup of coffee. He glanced up as the bell on the door jingled, and his heart jumped into his throat. Colonel Wesley Miller walked in, moving with the same deliberate pace, and took a seat at the counter. For a long minute, Davies battled with himself. He could just pay his check and leave. He could pretend he hadn't seen him. But the colonel's words echoed in his mind. "See the man." He stood up, walked to the counter and spoke to the waitress, quietly paying for Miller's coffee. Then he walked over to the old colonel. Miller looked up from his menu, his blue eyes recognizing him instantly. Davies didn't salute. He didn't offer excuses. He just stood there for a moment. "Sir," he said, his voice quiet and steady. "Thank you for the lesson." Colonel Miller looked at the young man, truly seeing him for the first time not as an antagonist but as a young officer who had learned a hard truth. A small, genuine smile formed on his face. He simply nodded. "You're welcome, son. Now go on, finish your breakfast." Davies nodded back, a weight lifting from his shoulders he didn't know was there, and returned to his booth. No more words were needed. If you were moved by this story of honor and respect, please like this video and share it with someone who appreciates the values of our veterans. Subscribe to Veteran Valor for more tales of unassuming heroes who walk among us. Your support helps us continue to bring these important stories to light.